Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications. So Tim, how's your summer? You've been traveling around the country. Where have you been these days?
Well, yes, right around the beginning of summer, I went to, as we talked about previously on the podcast, I went to Nashville for a week for the Heritage Resource Bank conference and had a great time there and got to interview some interesting people that you've heard on the podcast. And then not too long after that, I had the opportunity to visit Boston. And it was a sad trip, the occasion. I went to a memorial service for a friend who passed away during COVID. But I did have some time during my trip. I built in a couple of extra days to check out the sites. I'd never been to Boston before, and I really had a great time. And my hotel was great right across from Boston Commons. I got the chance to, walk the Freedom Trail from end to end. I did a little Boston Harbor cruise. I went to the JFK Library where I got to see I thought this was kind of cool. My former boss, Mike Valines, who was former Assembly Republican leader, he is a Profile and Courage Award winner. So I got to go see they have a area where they have a tribute to all the honorees. And I took a picture and texted it to him. And he said, well, that reminds me how much hair I used to have back in the day when I got this honor. But I went all over. And one of the things that struck me was Boston has a lot in common with San Francisco. They're roughly similar in population. They're both very far left cities, yet Boston has such better quality of life. There is homelessness, but not that much. And especially the chronically homeless on the streets, significantly less than San Francisco. Crime, yes, they have more crime than the national average, but nothing like what you see in San Francisco. So it got me thinking, what is the difference? Why is a seemingly very city with very similar political outlook have such a different experience than San Francisco? And I think the approach really comes to the very left politicians that run Boston have realized they can do whatever they want as far as their left agenda, as long as quality of life is good. That even those who live in a very left-wing city expect clean streets, safe neighborhood, that they don't have people accosting them with aggressive panhandling or going to the bathroom in front of them on the streets. That there are kind of limits that even liberal voters will expect, and that's something that politicians in San Francisco, for the most part, have forgotten. Now, maybe things are changing a little bit with the recall of the school board and the recall of Chesa Boudin, but I think that's really what it is, that they understand that quality of life matters and that they want to see their politicians doing something when there is an uptick in crime. Like I write in the blog, a few months back, there was an uptick in incidents in violent crime in certain neighborhoods of Boston. Well, instead of kind of wringing their hands, city officials stood up. The city council president quoted saying, yes, it's unfortunate, but we've increased patrols. We're taking direct action now. And I think that's important that you see, even though all very liberal and support very liberal criminal justice and homeless policies, that they're taking action and are being seen as taking action, that we don't tolerate this here and we are acting in response to the concerns of the neighborhood and residents of the city. So I think really that difference in leadership and leadership style is why Boston is, so much better on these things than San Francisco. So maybe the politicians in San Francisco could learn a thing or two from their colleagues in the original city on a hill.
So, Tim, I love Boston. I don't visit there often, but I love the culture. I love the institutions that are there. And I think the city of Boston has really done a great job in terms of presenting Boston in such a wonderful way, and how proud we are that as one of the original founding cities of America. It's really beautiful. And I hope listeners who haven't been to Boston, see it because it's a wonderful city. So Tim, I've been following the financial markets because I've got a background in investing. We're now in bear market territory, and one thing I've been wondering for a long time is what would happen if investors had to choose between having a portfolio that's pretty solid performing or one that has ESG stocks. Well, we've got a bear market going on. So I thought it was an intriguing question. What would investors prefer? So now there's a new survey out that actually sheds some light on this question. So the survey is by Echelon Insights and the Daily Wire, and they polled 1,000 investors. And funny, it showed that nearly 2/3 of those who answered the survey believe that individual investors should ultimately decide whether their retirement funds or their pension funds ought to be allocating according to an ESG criteria. And only 20% believe that Wall Street asset managers should be making this call. And interestingly enough, an even higher margin of those surveyed, close to 2/3 versus 20%, support the right of an investor to opt out of an ESG style investment. And a lot of them support the state's decision to pull pension funds from investments that are not strictly focused on performance. So as our listeners know, we've done a lot of work in this area, especially Wayne Weingarten, who did a study a few years ago, back in 2019, comparing these ESG types of investments with just a plain vanilla S&P 500 index fund. And you know what? The ESG funds did not outperform the S&P 500 portfolio. So it's something to think about. And I'm glad there's some hard data now showing how investors really think about this issue.
Well, and it's certainly something to be concerned about if you're an individual investor, but it's also a huge deal if you're investing public dollars in public pension funds. And in a lot of Wayne's work, we've talked about how state treasurers around the country are increasingly making political decisions with how they invest state pension fund dollars. And as the results show here, they're often a bad investment. And the responsibility of state treasurers and state pension funds is to grow the fund for retirees and taxpayers. Because if the fund doesn't grow, it's taxpayers who are on the hook. More people are waking up to this. I know at Heritage, I sat in a presentation with a group of conservative state treasurers who are launching an effort to educate people on these issues and really focus on these decisions being made in the best interest of taxpayers and retirees.
Well, to that point, another troubling trend is that government regulators are also using ESG to drive a lot of rulemaking in the agencies in Washington. So that's something that we're watching out for. And as listeners know, we've been out front on this area. And so look for more work from PRI on ESG. So before we introduce our guest, I want to make a plug for our luncheon with Manhattan Institute's Heather McDonald. We're having a lunch for her in Newport Beach at the Pacific Club. She's going to partner with our PRI fellow, Steve Smith, and they'll be discussing rising crime in California as well as homelessness. So that's on Tuesday, August 2nd. Should be a terrific discussion. The last time we had Heather was back in 2019, pre-COVID. So if anything else, crime has gotten a lot worse in California, and we're excited to have her.
So our guest this week is Michael Pack. Really an interesting guy, and he's had a very interesting career in conservative public policy, but also in filmmaking. And if you remember from a few years back, he's responsible for the terrific documentary on Clarence Thomas called Created Equal, Clarence Thomas in His Own Words, which received national acclaim. Well, as we discussed with him, 95% of what he filmed for that documentary didn't make it into the film. So it was decided, hey, there's a lot of good stuff that was left on the cutting room floor. What can we do with that? And so they decided to make a book of it, and it's of the same name. And so we talked with Michael about his book, and we can't recommend the book and the film more highly. If you're a fan of Clarence Thomas or interested in kind of the inner workings of the Supreme Court, both of these are for you.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. And here's Michael Pack. Welcome to Next Round, Michael.
Thank you. It's great to be on. Thank you for
So,
having me on.
so many of our listeners are familiar with the film Created Equal, Clarence Thomas in his own words. Your new book of the same name is out, and you've said that 95% of the book didn't make it into the film. So let's take a step back for a moment before talking about the book. How did you become interested in the life of Justice Clarence Thomas? And what was it that convinced you that his story had to be told?
Good question. Well, it was several years ago, and friends of Justice Thomas were concerned that his enemies were telling his story and distorting it. HBO was about to come out with a movie, which they eventually did release, with Kerry Washington as Anita Hill, called Confirmation, that looked like it was going to be yet another attack on Justice Thomas. So they wanted a response, and they reached out to me, and I dimly remembered his confirmation in 1991, but I didn't know that much about him. So I met him, and it was really only took one meeting to convince me that he had a great story, that he was a great storyteller with a great voice. And I right away wanted to do it. I read his memoirs. I saw there was really a great story there. And at first, we thought maybe we would do a traditional documentary, a biography of him, but interviewing, 15 or 20 people from all all eras of his life, of all points of view. And eventually I came to see that his voice would get lost. And the best thing to do was to let him tell his story in his own words. So I changed the format of the film, and it's now based on this very long interview with Clarence Thomas. And I interviewed him for over 24 hours over a 4-month period, the longest interview ever granted to any filmmaker ever in the history of the court. And also, he's the only interview except Ginny, who I interviewed for 5 or 6 hours. So it's a very long interview. We were very honored that he granted it to us, and he had no editorial control, so it was a lot of trust. But it is only a 2-hour film, and it has a lot of other material, recreations, archival footage. So it's less than 2 hours of the interview. And my co-author, Mark Paoletta, who is a long-term friend of the Thomases and as a young lawyer helped in the 1991 confirmation, he felt strongly that we shouldn't leave all that material on the cutting room floor. The film was very, very successful, and people were asking for more. So we went over the interview and we created the book out of the interview. It too follows basically his life story, but because it's a book, it has 95% new material, just as you said, Rowena. So people like the film, or if they're just interested in his life, this is a way to find out a lot more about it. And it has a lot more, for instance, about his years on the court and his jurisprudence and how he thinks about cases.
So let's start with a focus on Justice Thomas's early life. So young Clarence Thomas was largely raised by his grandfather, who had a tremendous impact on his youth. Could you discuss their relationship?
Yeah, I think that is, Clarence Thomas always says that is the most significant relationship and had the greatest impact on his life. So you have to go back, Tim, even a little earlier, right? He was born in Pinpoint, Georgia, a Gullah Geechee area on the coast of Georgia, outside of Savannah. So English isn't even his first language, and he grows up in rural poverty. They live in these shacks, with whole wooden shacks patched together with bits of newspaper. And, and then his father leaves when he's still a toddler. So he's raised by his mother, and he's there till he's about 6. And then she moves to Savannah with Justice Thomas and his brother. And there, as he said, he exchanged rural poverty for urban squalor. And in Savannah, she was working as a maid. She lived in this very rundown house. They had the outhouse, flushed into the neighbor's yard, and the neighbor's outhouse flushed into their yard. They didn't have enough to eat. They were hungry often. They were cold in the winter. His mother would bring Justice Thomas to school, and no one cared. He'd just leave school and wander the streets alone. And after several years of that, his mother realized she couldn't take care of these 2 boys and brought them to her father, his grandfather, as you mentioned, Tim, to raise. And as Justice Thomas says, that walk from his mother's house to his grandfather's house was the most significant event in his life, changed it entirely. His grandfather was this powerful figure. First thing he says to these 2 little boys is, "The damn vacation is over." And they're thinking, what vacation? They're living in squalor in Savannah. And it's work all the time. They got to work from sun to sun, as he likes to say. They got to get up. They got to go to school. When they're back from school, they got to work with him on his home heating oil delivery business on the truck. And it's rules and regulations, manners and morals, as he says. And although he himself is less than a third grade education and is functionally illiterate, he believes in education, and he sends Clarence Thomas and his brother to parochial schools.
So, Michael, the other major event that forever changed the course of Clarence Thomas's life was that his grandfather enrolled him in a parochial school. So describe the influence of these Catholic nuns and how they would forever become part of his life.
And let's not forget, this is the 50s. It's the segregated South. These are all Black schools run by these Irish nuns. And after his grandfather, they're the second most powerful influence on his life. They continue to give him hard work and discipline, and they give him a rigorous curriculum. And really, it changes his life around, and he thrives in that environment, up to the point where he even decides he wants to be a priest and enters the seminary. I mean, so from there, though, it takes an amazing twist. I mean, now we're in the mid-60s, and he's entered the seminary, as I say, and the seminaries were formerly all white, and he's one of the first groups to integrate them. And there he starts to experience some racism, which he had not before. And it reaches a peak in 1968 when he's watching TV, and one of the white seminary, and they watch TV, and the news has the shooting of Martin Luther King. And one of the white seminarians says, "I hope that SOB dies." And that, as he said, clinched it for him. It ended his vocation. He became, it capped off his conversion to Black radicalism. He thinks his grandfather is a sucker for working so hard. He becomes, in his own words, an angry Black man. Race and racism explains everything. He's just totally radicalized. And he tells his grandfather he's not going to be a priest. Grandfather kicks him out of the home, the only home he ever knew, the only father really he ever had. And he's on his own. He has to go wherever he can get free tuition, which is Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. And there he continues his radical activity. He helped start a Black student union, engages in a Black walkout. He invites Black Panthers to come to campus to speak, one of them waving a gun around. He supports every Black radical, Angela Davis, H. Rap Brown, whoever, Malcolm X. And he has this radical period. And the next part of his life is his working through that and coming back to the values of his grandfather and the nuns. And that's a longer process.
What made him change his mind and turn away from that life of radicalism?
It was a very complicated journey. I mean, it was in part an intellectual journey, but also things he saw around him. The first moment really was when he went to an anti-war rally in Cambridge near Harvard, and the rally turned into a riot. And they had already gone to a liquor store ahead of time, and he got caught up in the violence. He was part of the mob, and he sort of got into the violence, and he did not like what he was becoming. So even though he had fallen away from the church, when he got back to Holy Cross, it was, the wee hours of the morning. The chapel was closed, but he knelt in front of the chapel and prayed to God for the first time in a bunch of years and said to God, if he would take anger out of his heart, he would never hate again. And that was his beginning of his slow journey back. And a whole bunch of other things happened. He saw affirmative action fail. He saw busing fail in the Boston area. Remember, he's still in the Boston area.
So, Michael, there were other big influencers in Justice Thomas's life. He was a big fan of Ayn Rand, of Thomas Sowell, Frederick Douglass, and others. So talk about some of the people and the writings that helped him form his views on life, including his governing and judicial philosophy.
He started to read different people. He was very influenced by Ayn Rand. He still makes his 4 clerks watch the movie of The Fountainhead every year. He read Thomas Sowell, who was perhaps the most influential contemporary writer on him. He was influenced by Ralph Ellison and many other books. And he thought his way out of the left and came back to what he thought of as his grandfather and the nuns' core values. But this time he saw them in light of the values of the founding of the country. which is why we call the film Created Equal. The intellectual anchor for him was the Declaration of Independence and its principles, which underlay the Constitution. So he made that journey back until finally first person Republican he voted for was Ronald Reagan in 1980, and he ended up working in the Reagan administration, first the Department of Education and then chairman of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And so that entered the sort of the next phase of his life when he's a public figure. And to be a conservative Black man in public life was to be attacked by the left, and the attacks started immediately and haven't ceased to this day.
So no book on Justice Thomas, of course, can leave out his confirmation hearings, which perhaps was one of the most controversial in recent history. So what are Justice Thomas's thoughts upon reflecting on that event more than 30 years ago?
We did interview him extensively on that, and I think that was the most difficult part of the interview for him. We sort of, sad to say in a way, we forced him to relive it, and you could still see that it is still painful. It was during that part of the interview that Justice Thomas suggested that I interview Ginny in addition, which I wasn't originally planning to do. And that was, in fact, the only suggestion he ever made about the film at all. So naturally, I took it. And he felt that they were really together during that time. It cemented their marriage. And he thought she could say things that he could not, and he was right. But he talks about what it was like to live through it. And although I thought I had kind of remembered it, I really didn't. And seeing it from his eyes was really revelatory. I mean, many people don't even remember, that there was a whole week of hearing before Anita Hill even showed up, right? So he's nominated by George H.W. Bush, and right away they say he's an affirmative action hire, he's not qualified. They start throwing things at him. He smoked marijuana, he has a Confederate flag, and they had to bat down all these charges. And then there's the week of being grilled by the Senate Judiciary Committee. Now, the Senate at that time, this is 1991, was in Democratic hands, and the chairman of the committee was then Senator Joe Biden, now president. And he asked, they grilled Clarence Thomas to try to get what he would say about abortion, they tried to get him to sort of stumble and make a mistake. And it was a grueling interview. And abortion was really the key, even back then. The women's groups really organized strongly against him. I mean, so did the traditional civil rights groups, and the women's groups needed them as cover, as Justice Thomas says. And it was really a hard hearing. It was a lot like the Bork hearing in a way that had preceded it in the sort of hostility of many of the questions. And when it was over, the committee split 6-6. And that's sufficient to send the nomination up to the full Senate. And the full Senate was going to vote. And Justice Thomas and Ginny went off on vacation. And they thought, wow, we survived that. Thank God that's over. Only to find out a few days later that Anita Hill's testimony and allegations had been leaked illegally to Newsday and NPR. And once they were leaked and it was out there, the Senate decided the Judiciary Committee had to reconvene. And then they had that part of the hearings that most of us remember, where Anita Hill claimed that Clarence Thomas talked to her about pornographic films and tried to date her and said other inappropriate things 8 or 9 years before the hearings. Some people misremember it to be an accusation of physical assault, but it was not that. I mean, we've seen so much of that since. And it was shocking at the time, and it was shocking to hear that stuff in the Senate. And Justice Thomas was advised by his spin doctors to sort of go easy on it, but he decided he needed to defend himself strongly. He gave that speech we all remember, the high-tech lynching speech, where he compared the behavior of the Senate to a lynch mob in the South. And he defended himself really aggressively. As he said, he didn't care whether he was nominated. He felt he was defending the principles of his grandfather and the Irish nuns that raised him. And when it was over, the country believed him. It was a 2-1. People believed Justice Thomas and not Anita Hill, and that included a majority of African Americans and a majority of women. So that's why, really, the Senate finally confirmed him. However, the left continues its attack and even its reinterpretation of those events, and it's probably not like that anymore. But it's still the case that he defended himself and he was convincing, and it's in a very memorable moment, and we all that are over a certain age remember it. And those that don't remember it were probably made to remember it during the Kavanaugh hearings, which followed a very similar playbook.
Michael, did the justice ever think at one point that he should withdraw his nomination, or that was just not even in consideration?
He says to the committee he would rather die than withdraw. because he felt withdrawal was as he said, letting bullies push him around. And he feels that his grandfather, who always thought you should fight back against bullies, would be disappointed in him. How would he face them when he got to heaven? So he did not consider withdrawal. I have heard that there was a lot of pressure on President George H.W. Bush to withdraw his nomination. I think it's remarkable, and to the president's credit, that he did not. I mean, it seemed like Justice Thomas was going to be a big liability and a horrible, humiliating defeat for him. So he stuck by Justice Thomas, and I think that's really one of the achievements of his administration.
So the book's subtitle is In His Own Words. Now, Justice Thomas has been criticized by the left for not asking questions or sparring with lawyers during hearings. What is his thinking behind this?
Well, we talked to him at length about that, both in the film and even at greater length in the book. But I mean, he felt that the oral argument period on the court was getting to be sort of a free-for-all, and that each advocate is really granted only 30 minutes to make their case. And if they're interrupted by justices or justices cross-talking to each other, that it takes away from their time, and they don't feel at the end that they've had a chance to make their case. So he doesn't like that kind of oral argument. Now, since COVID, or during COVID, really, they changed the pattern. I mean, it was all via, video conference. So questions went in order of seniority in an orderly way. And since that's something that Justice Thomas was more comfortable with, he asked many questions during that period. And they've continued that pattern since they've been back, now that they're doing it in person. And he continues to ask more questions. But I think it's important to realize, and this is, Justice Thomas speaks about that in the film and the book, that that's not the core work of the court. It's an appeals court. Those of us that are not lawyers are used to thinking of courts, like To Kill a Mockingbird or Perry Mason, where it's a big drama in front of a jury. But that's not what an appeals court is. Mostly it's in writing, right? Everyone submits briefs. There are many, many amicus briefs supporting the two briefs. There are hundreds and hundreds of pages, and it's all dealt with in writing. And the oral argument is just a little bit to add to things that haven't been covered in writing, which mostly it has been. And then the work of the court is circulating the briefs and then debating them, as we found with the Dobbs case, where the brief that Samuel Alito had drafted and was circulating got leaked, thus short-circuiting their normal process. But Justice Thomas has always been a leader in these other areas of the court's jurisprudence. And in fact, he has written more opinions than any other justice. I think by now there are over 750. And year to year, he writes close to double whatever the nearest justice has written. He usually writes 30 plus, and other justices are more like in the 10 to 15 range. So he's very active. The media has created an impression of a unintelligent, inactive, non-caring, checked out justice, but it is the opposite. The opposite is really the case.
Michael, what do you see as Justice Thomas's legacy in the Supreme Court and to the nation? How do you think historians will write about him?
I think that he has tried to bring the court back to its core principles, to affirm the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution, and the writings, the Constitution itself and the amendments, and the understanding that he feels the business of judges is not to opine, but to see whether it reflects what is in the Constitution and the amendments based on the public understanding at the time. And I think he will be remembered for bringing the court back to those core principles. I mean, you can see, this is not true probably for your listeners, but you could see it even in the coverage of the Dobbs case. People assume that Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas, that they're giving their view on abortion, but they're not. They're trying to determine whether there's a right to abortion in the 14th Amendment. And that's it. As Justice Thomas says in the film, good laws can be unconstitutional, bad laws can be constitutional. That is their job. And I think he will be remembered for that. I think there's a core area of his jurisprudence that got touched on in this last term, his thinking about the administrative state that came up in the EPA case. I think there'll be more cases along those lines in the future. And he talks about that at length too. And there's a lot in the way administrative agencies function that seems to be questionable from a constitutional standpoint. And I think people will examine that. And there's the issue of whether we should be governed by elected branches, such as Congress, or whether they can simply delegate all that to unaccountable executive branch agencies, some of which are barely accountable even to the executive branch, and essentially pass legislation called regulations, adjudicate it, and then enforce it. And I think we're going to look closely at that in the next few years. I think the court will look closely at that.
So let's talk a little bit about filmmaking. The left dominates Hollywood and filmmaking, of course. Talk to us about the importance of film in shaping hearts and minds, and how conservatives seemingly been very slow to adopt it. In your view, is this changing, and your film being evidence of that?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the people on the sort of conservative, libertarian, right of center side have sort of left this aspect of the culture totally in the hands of the left and the progressive left. And I think it has a great cost. I think the stories we tell our children about our recent history or distant past, our current events, shape the next generation's thinking. And I think that has been obvious to many people for decades, just not on the left. Andrew Breitbart said that, politics is downstream from culture, but he was not the first to make that kind of observation. Percy B. Shelley said poets are the unacknowledged legislators of mankind. By poets, he meant creators of any kind of art and culture. It's been obvious since Plato and Aristotle, who had mixed views about it all, but recognized its importance. We have foolishly ceded this to the left, and it is totally the fault of people on the conservative side. It's a free market. We are free to make these things and get them out there. As you say, Tim, my film is an example of that. We simply have failed to do it. We on our side have invested in books and conferences and think tanks. And since PRI is a think tank, we are happy that they do. That we're not saying don't invest in think tanks, and especially in political campaigns. But that is not enough. The left has been serious about culture since the long march of the institutions in the 60s, when they failed to create violent revolution in America. They focused on taking over the universities, and then the other institutions of culture, like Hollywood, like documentaries, like the news media. And we have to be serious about getting it back. It's a matter of putting in the time and money. I say really that left spends, in my estimate, at least tens of billions on documentaries and sort of small feature films that deal with history. I mean, the Netflix alone has an annual content budget of $17 billion. So let's say only a quarter of that are progressive films and documentaries. It doesn't take much to get to $10 billion. Then there's the MacArthur Foundation, the Ford Foundation, production companies in LA dedicated to progressive films. So we on our side spend tens of millions. And as a recipient of some of that money, I'm happy to get that. And I think those people, I couldn't make my films without my funders. But a gap of 1,000 times, tens of millions to tens of billions over 50 years has created an entire ecosystem of progressive filmmakers. They've taken over film schools. They've got training programs. They've got film festivals. They've got composers, editors, cameramen. We need to be serious about it. We need to start now. We who believe in free markets have to take advantage of the fact that this is a free market and we can produce culture and be successful. And I agree with you, Tim. Created Equal is a good example of that.
So for our last question, Michael, we call our podcast Next Round because we have so many wonderful wineries across the state. And we'd like to ask our guests for a wine or beer or cocktail recommendation. So what are you drinking these days as you celebrate the launch of your new book?
Well, I have to say, Rowena, my wife, Gina, who is also my business partner. And one of the few things we actually disagree on is wine, but we're still able to keep our marriage together. She's like a big white wine fan, and I'm really lean to red wines. We're not such connoisseurs, but I will say that we celebrated the launch of our book recently. The book has only been out a couple of weeks with my friends bringing over Veuve Clicquot champagne. And that was really a great way to celebrate. Even though I'm a red wine fan, it was hard to resist that.
Well, you got to have champagne when you celebrate. Thanks so much, Michael.
Thank you.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.